Okay, so we just got the message that the webinar started, and for everyone's information, it is being recorded. To those of you who have signed on here, thank you for doing so. My name is Gary Daddario. I'm one of the partners here at Marcus Arrico, Emmer & Brooks. With me is Christopher Lanni, who is a principal of Secure Residential Services. And today, as you can see, hopefully on the screen, we're going to be discussing modern day security, and in particular, how associations should adjust to modern day security risks. I'm going to give just a little moment here before we start to proceed through the slides, because the participant count is showing that folks are still logging in. By way of introductory comment for those who are already on, we have allotted time at the end of the presentation for questions today. So we are perfectly happy to answer questions, but some may get answered during the course of the presentation. If not, then we are happy to answer those questions at the end. During the presentation, if you happen to have a question that's really pressing on that particular topic that we're discussing, or even more so on the slide that happens to be on the screen at the time, then please go ahead and submit that question. And we will be trying to monitor the questions as we go, so that if something's pressing, we will answer it during the presentation. And otherwise, we will use the Q&A time at the end to have the discussions on all the questions. Chris, any introductory comments that you want to make while folks are signing in?
So no, just great to be here with you. Great to have a chance to talk about this important topic. As we get into it a little bit, I'll get into some of the details, but independent security consultant who really specializes in residential security and spends time with clients. I also spend time in litigation on matters of negligence and inadequate security and wrongful death, et cetera. So I'll be speaking kind of from both perspectives, but a lot of what I'm going to get into would really be kind of the reasonable standard, right? How do we get to reasonable security measures? And then talk again, like you said, about some of the modern technology that's being used on sites. But it's going to be a great presentation and great to be with you.
Excellent, thank you. And again, thanks to all of those folks who are signing in to share the time with us and to get this information. Hopefully you find it helpful. We are at just a few minutes now past 12:30, so I'm going to go ahead and start going through this. For those who are already on and can hear us, the slides can be provided to anybody who wants a copy of the slides, so everybody will have that information after the fact. And in addition, MEEB is recording this session right now, and we will be making that available online as well. So if anybody misses it or comes in late or has to leave early and you want to be able to review any of the information, you'll be able to do so not only through the slides, but also checking the video of the presentation itself. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and start moving. Except that now the slide will not go forward. I wonder what just happened. Chris, will the slide move forward on your end?
Let me see. Give it a try here for you. No.
All right. Huh. I don't think I have any ideas. Okay, so one question that popped up, I already answered, but I'll say again, folks are wondering if the recording will be available to watch later, and yes, it will. MEEB is gonna make it available online. You can touch base with us for any additional information about how to get that. All right. I am concerned, oh, let's see. Okay. So it looks like bottom left, there's a screen button we can hit.
Okay.
Chris, I don't know why, during the test, the arrow buttons were working, now they're not.
Yeah.
but,
Okay.
They're
So-
button on the screen.
We'll make it work.
Okay, all right, so, what I'm gonna talk about first is the case that has, caused, a big stir in the legal community and a big stir among, association boards and property managers alike, because it is, unfortunately a tragedy. And, the legal case that's coming out of this tragedy, is actually causing a pretty major, change in thinking. And that's sort of why associations need to be looking at, and property managers need to be looking at the issue of security a little bit more than they used to be. So the case is Field versus Highbridge, and it's from the Suffolk Superior Court, right in Boston, Massachusetts. The overarching story here is that sometime during the late afternoon hours of May 5th, 2017, man that I'll refer to as Texera, gained access into the McAllen building. It's part of a condominium building. Access was made by way of the parking garage, and then to the 11th floor of the building. Ultimately, he forced his way into a unit that was occupied by two doctors, Richard Field and Lena Bolanos. They were both highly regarded anesthesiologists, and they were engaged to be married. And Mr. Texera, in what was a very sad incident, murdered both of these people in their condominium unit. So there's a little bit of history here on the perpetrator. Around October of 2015, Mr. Texera, who did have a criminal background, was hired by Palladian to work as a concierge employee. This condominium, I should mention, in addition to having a board, of course, and having professional property management, also utilized concierge services by way of vendors. And Palladian was the vendor at one time. He was an employee there. He quit in April of 2016 following a confrontation with a building resident. So that in and of itself is some unfortunate history that exists on him. In February of 17, the trust, meaning the condominium, terminated their agreement with Palladian, and they hired Highbridge Concierge. So there was a change in the concierge services vendor, and from that point going forward, Highbridge was in place. Prior to the murders of the doctors in May of 17, Highbridge, the new concierge service, was unaware that Texera had previously worked at the building. They were also unaware that he had prior criminal history, or that he had had an altercation once with a resident of the building. So there's also, in this case, a history of building security issues. In December of 2012, the owner of a convertible that was parked in the garage discovered that the top had been cut open in what was, I guess, a failed break-in attempt. Then in October of 2014, a vehicle parked in the garage was broken into by someone who had unknowingly been let into the garage area. In February of 15, the winter weather conditions, not surprising this being New England, were causing the garage doors to become stuck. A decision was made to keep the doors open on a permanent basis until conditions improved. You know, that's obviously an unfortunate situation that was thrust upon the people there. And, you know, they had to sort of weigh the situation based on the circumstances at hand at the time. Use of the doors was getting them stuck because of snow and ice. Of course, a decision to keep them open was allowing the residents, you know, ingress and egress as needed, but of course presents an obvious security risk in that the doors were open. In August of 2016, which was 9 months before the murders of the doctors, there was an email exchange between one of the doctors and the president of the association. He was expressing his shock because several neighbors were able to walk in and knock on his door. And so he raised concerns about the lack of security on the 11th floor of the building. I should note that the doctors were the only folks living on the 11th floor. And so the 11th floor was itself supposed to be a restricted access area. So that sort of provides some context. It wasn't that the doctor thought it was so strange for a neighbor to knock on his door. It was just that if the security systems were working in the building, people wouldn't have had unfettered access to the 11th floor at all. So trust meeting minutes for a meeting of February 23rd, 2017 made note of certain changes that were made by Highbridge. Again, that's the new concierge vendor, including an increased focus on garage security, especially when the weather is causing the doors to act up, and a reference was made to the need for a security upgrade. Okay, and now we get into the court case, and I just want to say, given the awful tragedy that occurred, you had the murder of two people in their own home, and the history that existed with respect to that particular perpetrator, Mr. Texera, and then the history of the building security issues that existed at the building. Before we even start talking about the specifics of the case, hopefully everybody understands that what we had here was a perfect storm in terms of the circumstances involved. Really just a perfect storm for a court case to really sort of shake up, you know, what had otherwise been the norm, which is to say that normally we think, well, when a third person commits a criminal action, someone else is not going to be liable for that because it was their conduct, it was their misconduct. And generally speaking, you know, one person doesn't have control over another. But the stage was set here where the background is, to use some very basic language, pretty ugly. So a court case ensues. In August of 2017, the personal representatives of the victims' estates filed claims for wrongful death, conscious pain and suffering, and for negligence against Highbridge, which is the concierge vendor, Bayberry, which is the professional property management of the association, and the trust being the condominium association itself. On April 27, 2022, Judge Christine Roach, again, Suffolk Superior Court in Boston, conducted a hearing on the motions for summary judgment that have been filed by the defendants. For those who are not familiar with that particular bit of legal terminology, a motion for summary judgment is a motion that you file with the court. And in such a motion, you say to the court essentially that my side should win. It can be filed by the plaintiff or the defendant. But what you're saying in the motion is, you know, you're speaking to the judge and you're saying, my side should win this case without a trial, because there is no mystery as to the facts. And if we look at the facts for what they are and we apply the law, we don't need a trial to determine the outcome. That's what a motion for summary judgment does. It's designed to try to bring the case to an end without actually going through the entire trial process. Judge Roach, in response to the motions for summary judgment, issued a 24-page decision July 5th of 2022. The reason why I would note in particular like that it was a 24-page decision is that, again, if folks are unfamiliar with the legal process or litigation or these type of motions, in 20 years of condominium law practice, which is what I've been up to for the past 20 years, of all the summary judgment motions that I've ever done, the longest decision I ever received was half of this. So the point is that the judge really not only went through the case very carefully, but issued a lengthy decision that carefully analyzed everything that was before her. The outcome was that with respect to the negligent claims, the claims for negligence rather, they were awarded dismissal pursuant to summary judgment, but the judge declined to dismiss the claims for wrongful death and for conscious pain and suffering. And that right there is sort of the origin of the ripple effect that went out through both the legal community and the condominium community. The case is not over yet, but the fact that summary judgment was denied with respect to claims for wrongful death and conscious pain and suffering is something that was not expected, in the condominium world, because most people felt comfortable saying, well, a condominium or its property manager are not going to be responsible for some third party that came to the property and committed a crime there. The fact that third parties, criminals that are out there in the world commit crimes, is not something that, people like condominium associations might be liable for. And by denying the motions for summary judgment, the court has instead told us that, yes, perhaps there will be liability found for these parties. So a little bit more information on claims for wrongful death. A defendant might face significant damages under the wrongful death statute if it is shown that their negligence caused the death of another person. To prove negligence with respect to this claim, the plaintiff needs to establish that the defendant or defendants owed a duty of reasonable care, that duty was breached, that there was resulting harm, and that there was a causal connection between the breach of the duty and the harm that was suffered. Those are basically the four what we would call elements of a legal claim. If the plaintiff proves the elements of the legal claim, then absent a successful defense, the plaintiff prevails. Now, what we'll talk about over the course of the next couple minutes is that the court focused at this point on the duty of reasonable care and whether or not the association and or the property manager was subject to a legal duty of reasonable care to prevent the harm that happened to the doctors. It's really important that this conversation about duty, because the rest flows. The other elements are that there was a breach, that harm resulted, and that there was a causal connection. And we know, based on the story of this case, that an outsider was able to access the building. Within the building, he was able to access the 11th floor that he shouldn't have been able to access. And then he murdered his two victims. So the other elements really fall into place if the association and or the property management owed reasonable care to be exercised for the safety of the doctors as they occupied their unit. So a duty of care as to the trust. So generally, and this is why this case is so important and it represents significant change. Generally, a landowner does not owe a duty to affirmatively protect visitors against the dangerous or unlawful acts of third persons. Similarly, landowners typically do not owe a duty to warn of open and obvious dangers on their premises, because it's not reasonably foreseeable that a visitor exercising reasonable care for their own safety would suffer injury from an obvious danger. There is a lack currently of appellate case law in Massachusetts regarding what duty, if any, is going to be owed by a condominium association to protect owners against the criminal acts of third parties that are carried out in the common areas of the condominium. The common areas, of course, being those areas over which the condominium association exerts control. So what areas of the condominium were implicated in the commission of the criminal act also becomes a significant question, because since the association controls the common areas, then potentially that original access that an outside wrongdoer gains may very well fall to a question of whether or not the association was reasonably maintaining security at the location. Now, in this case, I had mentioned that the 11th floor was supposed to be restricted, the building was supposed to be restricted, and access to the garage was supposed to be restricted. And depending on your community, you may have more or less restriction. There are those communities that are, so-called gated communities. And, when everything's working properly, people from the outside world would have trouble even getting into the outside property before they get to the building. In other situations, the circumstances are such that there's less access provided. But the important thing is to try to determine, as a property owner or as a condominium that's in charge of the common areas of your site, what's important is to focus on the characteristics of your site and what would be reasonable in terms of the measures that you might apply for providing a reasonable measure of security. So we have the court's opinion so far. And the reason why I say so far is because, as I mentioned, these were motions for summary judgment, which is where a party asks to win the case without a trial. And so even though a decision has been issued with respect to these motions, it doesn't end the case in the way that a trial does. And so those claims that the court has allowed to survive the summary judgment process, they will now go to trial. So there will be more that comes out of this case. But here's what we have for now based on the summary judgment decisions. Judge Roach reasoned that the existence of opportunistic crime, including even violent crime, accessed through public areas is a foreseeable fact of everyday life for most citizens, and condominium complexes are no exception. So 2 points to be made there. One is sort of the sad reality of modern society. We have a judge telling us really that all of us in everyday life pretty much just need to be able to know that crime, including violent crime, is just sort of always out there. The other concern is that, she's expressly stating now that condominium complexes are no exception, meaning that boards at condominiums and their professional property management also need to be concerned with these security issues. So the judge wrote in the decision, I accordingly believe that recognizing this duty is consistent with current Massachusetts law, as well as the teaching of Mullins regarding existing social values and customs. Now that reference to the Mullins case, that was a different case, obviously, and she quoted existing social values and customs. What the takeaway was from the Mullins case is that one party can owe a duty to another party if the social values and customs of the time sort of put that duty in place, and if that's sort of the recognized norm. And so many of us would think that, for instance, if we were visiting a hotel and staying in a hotel for the night, that hotel has taken on some measure of control over the security of the room where we are. That would be a norm and a custom. And so the judge felt that with respect to the condominium, at least the common areas of the condominium, that too is consistent. The idea that the association would have control over those areas and as a result provide some measure of security. So the judge went on in the summary judgment decision to say that for the purposes of the summary judgment record before me, I conclude that it was reasonably foreseeable to the trust that an intruder could enter the garage, access floor 11, as described and acknowledged was possible, and then harm the residents. The fact that no other armed home invasion or murder had occurred at the premises before May 5th of 2017 cannot detract at this stage of the case from all of the other circumstantial evidentiary factors pointing to a duty based on foreseeability, whether that duty is found in common law or contract. So what does all that mean? It means that the judge decided that these claims for wrongful death are going to trial. The defendants are not going to win without a trial. And the reason is that a duty was in place, and it was foreseeable, according to the judge, it should have been foreseeable that especially given the history and the security issues that the association was aware of, that if someone wanted to, and they were up to no good, they could exploit the weaknesses in the building security and find their way into the building and to the 11th floor, as they did in this case. The judge found that, if your garage door has an issue, if you know that the 11th floor is supposed to be restricted, but for some reason the elevator keeps going up there when people push the button, if you know these things, then in the judge's opinion, you are saddled with a crime committed by an outsider who goes ahead and accesses the building as described is foreseeable to you. It's something that you have to be able to imagine would happen. A little more on the court's opinion so far with respect to Bayberry, and Bayberry again is the professional property management involved. Judge Roach opined that Bayberry had assumed the trust's duty to protect the condominium's common areas from intruders pursuant to its management agreement with the trust. In other words, and possibly not surprisingly, when the property manager or management company entered into a contract with the association and said, we are going to take care of the common areas for you, then according to the judge, there was an assumption there of that duty to keep the common areas in good condition, including making sure that any security measures were operating properly. Judge Roach also, of course, spoke to Highbridge, and Highbridge again is the concierge service vendor that was employed by this association to provide those services at this condominium. And the judge found that they had assumed a duty to protect the common areas from intruders, and that it was reasonably foreseeable that the negligent performance of their access control to the building could result in an intruder gaining access to the building and committing a violent attack on a resident. And in so ruling, the judge reasoned that one of the core reasons for access control to condominium buildings, whether it's through a concierge service or some other means, which could be locking doors, intercoms, key fobs, access cards, you name it. There's a lot of ways to exercise access control of your building. The judge found that by whatever means you're restricting access, one of the reasons would be to prevent criminal conduct against the residents or their property. That would be one of the primary goals that you would have, in the judge's opinion, if you are making any efforts to keep the general public out of your property. So present day takeaways regarding this case. Associations, property managers, and other service providers cannot assume that they do not owe a duty to the condominium owners and residents in the building. Until fairly recently, that was definitely an issue that was up for debate. And again, I think a lot of people would have assumed until recently that in that debate, the winning side would be the side that says, hey, if a criminal commits misconduct, some third party that isn't us, we're not liable for that. But as we can see, the ultimate outcome of this case may change that. Caution must be taken to ensure that safety and security protocols, as well as communications about them, are clear and not misleading. Where there's a reason to believe security measures are necessary, reasonable and appropriate steps should be taken. And by the way, that's what we had here. I mentioned a perfect storm of bad circumstances. Within the legal community, lawyers are fond of saying that bad facts lead to bad law. And this case really presented a laundry list of bad facts, because as I said, Texera had previously worked there and had a confrontation with a building resident. And that's why he was gone. He also himself had a prior criminal history. And then the association was aware that their garage doors sometimes acted funny. And they were also aware that the 11th floor that was supposed to be restricted for whatever reason wasn't restricted, because the elevator was going up there and opening the doors whenever anybody hit the button. And so they had reason to believe in this case that there were some issues that needed addressing. And unfortunately, those issues were not addressed prior to the time when Texera accessed the 11th floor and committed this awful crime. So in the end, we know that associations may benefit from security services vendors who can assist by bringing to bear their professional experience and their industry knowledge. And this is not surprising. In condominium associations, I think most boards and even property managers are accustomed to allowing the quote unquote professionals to do their jobs. In other words, even though a condominium has a board, and even though a condominium has a property manager, together, those people decide when there's a legal issue that they need to reach out to the association's attorney. When there's a question or issue with the finances, they reach out to a CPA. When they're looking for someone to take care of the lawn, they're looking for a landscaper. And snow removal services get done by a snowplower, and they hire people in the trades to deal with plumbing and electrical issues. Excuse me. So this notion is not new at all, that the board and property management might need to reach out to a more particular vendor to provide services to an association. What is a little new is the notion that there are security services vendors out there, and that those folks now should be brought into the stable of the usual vendors, because security concerns are something that we now all have to pay more attention to, perhaps, than we did in the past. Okay, so with that, I'm shifting gears a little bit within the presentation that I'm giving. And having discussed that case and with that as the backdrop, I'm now going to talk about some of the things that associations can do with respect to security measures. These, in this first part, will be the analog options, which some people might choose to refer to as the old school measures. These would be the low tech answers to the issue of security. So stronger doors would be helpful, particularly if an association has any knowledge about deficiencies in their doors, or any questions about the materials that were used or the strength of materials that have been used for their doors. Likewise with locks, a stronger lock together with a stronger door is going to increase security. Window bars have been looked at for a long time now, both by single family homeowners and associations. And believe it or not, the window bar industry is out there. They're doing well. They, like everybody else, are sort of advancing with the times. And whereas I think a lot of people hear the idea of window bars and their immediate reaction is, there's no way you can expect us to make our building look like a prison or make the windows look like people are trapped in prison. And that's really sort of a silly idea for condominium, especially where people have agreed to a certain scheme of aesthetics. But within the window bar industry now, you'll find that companies are making these bars that, while they provide security, they're designed in such a way now that some of them are actually meant to add to the aesthetics. They look more like a decoration than anything else, even though they provide additional security. So we also have gates and fencing around property that can represent what we'll call low tech solutions, signage, and we've got some examples here with the pictures, restricted areas and no trespassing signs, things of that nature. Intercom for building access. There's a little bit of technology there, but that technology is old enough and basic enough that I included it in this part. We all remember it's usually the butt of jokes on TV shows and sitcoms sometimes, but the good old intercom system where someone has to buzz someone in the building and speak to them, to convince them to unlock the door and allow them access. Finally, what I'm calling a hybrid option are the key fobs in the access cards that now sort of blend traditional access methods with modern technology. And the benefits of some of these systems include date, time, and ID stamps and reports. And so if you're utilizing such a system, when individual persons use those key fobs or those access cards to open up the door of the building or access the parking garage or things like that, the association that's maintaining that system has the ability to run reports, and they can see who exactly went where and on what date and at what time. I can tell you that I work with at least one client who, having made an investment in a system like this, is very happy that they did. They've already used it to address multiple issues in their parking garage, one of which was damage to the parking garage gate, and one of which was an act of vandalism that was committed against a resident's vehicle. And having these systems combined with security cameras allowed them to identify people who were accessing the garage at a particular date and time, which ultimately led to the resolution of these issues by way of the identification of the perpetrators. So these systems do work. I have worked with a couple of clients already who have been helped by these systems. Some additional analog options, on-site personnel. Associations vary, and this is probably on the expensive side of options, but for those associations who have the finances for it, on-site personnel obviously can be a big deterrent for any crime. And if nothing else, it provides additional eyes who can report to the authorities as soon as something starts to go wrong. Neighborhood watch, very old-fashioned concept here, but they still exist, and those can be coordinated with local police. Going back a ways, it now seems like a slightly different life, but at a time when I was new to this industry, but doing what I'm doing, representing condominium associations, I lived in one myself. I was on the board, and one of the things that we did when there started to be some security concerns within our general area was we established a neighborhood watch. We got involved with the local police, and they were surprisingly helpful. They were willing to come to meetings at the clubhouse. They were willing to assist us. They were willing to educate and speak to the community about measures that everyone could take to try to improve their degree of safety and security. So although an old-fashioned notion, perhaps, I wouldn't count that one out. That can still work too. Other analog options include property census and vehicle registry. What I mean by that are, and a lot of associations do this already, would be like a form that gets circulated and updated on an annual basis, where they're collecting information about who owns the units, who occupies the units, how many people are in there, what are their names. And then similarly, the vehicle registry would be to identify the vehicles of the people who live on the property, and whose vehicles are supposed to be in your parking lot. Having that information from a security standpoint allows you to more easily identify when there are people around who should not be there, or when there are vehicles perhaps in your parking lot that shouldn't be there. I will say that, of course, in the context of doing these types of registries, boards do hear feedback from a certain percentage of unit owners who say, you know, this is an invasion of my privacy. You don't have a right to this information. I don't want to give you this information. But at the end of the day, even if you're not looking at this from a security standpoint, it is also still a safety issue. I have unfortunately worked with some clients that have had major catastrophes on their property, including, for example, fires that have caused the destruction in some cases of an entire building. I can tell you, knowing as I do through these clients, that when the first responders hit the scene, and I'm talking about, you know, firefighters, paramedics, they want to know, and they want to know right away, who is supposed to be in this building, because that's how they can account for people and possibly realize, hopefully sooner rather than later, if there's someone in that building who they still need to try to help. So, you know, these really are very important safety issues, in addition to, you know, the notion of security relative to crime. It's also a safety issue concerning, you know, other types of unfortunate events that can occur. Other analog options, and again, this just means we're talking about, you know, non-technological items, would be rules enforcement and court actions. You know, the board has a fiduciary duty at any association to enforce the provisions of the governing documents. And so to the extent you have owners or residents who are violating provisions of the governing documents, technically the board really should be taking those issues up. If it's people who shouldn't be on the property, accessing the property, you might issue an order of no trespass. If it's someone who normally has a right to be on the property, but needs their behavior to be controlled, the association can seek an injunction. And an injunction is an order from the court that focuses on behavior as opposed to money. Everybody thinks about court actions and lawsuits, and they think, you know, damages and dollars. An injunction is a court order that tells someone that they have to do something, excuse me, or conversely, that they have to stop doing something if they're engaging in inappropriate behavior. I will share really quickly two sort of recent stories, excuse me, about injunction cases. And this is further example of the fact that in recent years, for whatever reason, behavior seems to be getting worse out there. Folks seem to be taking much greater leeway in the things that they do. And I think the events of recent years have also caused, you know, certain types of, you know, mental illness to be either irritated or to appear in people who, you know, prior to now maybe didn't have such issues. In one case, a unit owner constructed for himself a mace weapon. And I'm talking about a medieval weapon. If you've seen pictures, I'm sure we all have somewhere or another of folks engaged in hand-to-hand combat in medieval times. We're talking about a club with spikes on it that's designed obviously to inflict damage and injury. In this case, it was made by the unit owner hammering nails through a table leg. And once that mace was constructed, it was used in various assaults and threats of physical harm to other owners in the building. An injunction was granted in that case, and the result became that the unit owner sold the unit and left, which of course was best for all involved at the association. In another case, the association had security footage of a unit owner's tenants who they believed to be selling illegal drugs on the property. They sought an injunction. The court in that case denied the injunction. The court felt that although the security footage showed these people exchanging handfuls of money for baggies of a white powdery substance, that the association was unable to prove what that white powdery substance was. I guess the judge entertained the possibility that, there was a raging talcum powder business, perhaps going on in the parking lot, but for whatever reason, because the association didn't prove that they were illegal drugs, the judge decided not to issue an injunction. Sadly, some months later, those individuals stabbed and robbed other residents who lived at the condominium. So my point is, these situations seem to be getting more and more severe in recent times, and boards, as much as it's not a fun thing to do, and can be a problematic and difficult endeavor, boards really do need to involve themselves in these situations, and the sooner the better. Because what I think we see consistently from case to case is that these situations, when they're allowed to continue and flourish, they get worse over time. Once someone starts to go down that road, they tend to not improve their behavior on their own. So now I'm going to talk about some technology-based options. The Internet of Things, as it's called. These would be the smart devices. This slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, has some basic information about the Internet of Things. There are billions of people and devices out there, and all the smart devices are now, becoming popular all over our houses. When it comes to associations, what we hear a lot about are the so-called smart locks, or security cameras, or video doorbells. Some advantages of these devices: obviously, you can provide residents access to common doors via things like cell phone apps. You can save the hassle of dealing with keys and controlling the keys that everyone has. Residents can provide access to guests remotely if they choose to. They can track the access history. I talked a little bit about that with the key fobs and the cards. That can also happen with the smart locks and some of these apps. And the keypadded locks may also be able to be programmed with individualized codes, so that even if it's not a smartphone or an app, you might have residents each using their own code. And so again, that would allow you to know who opened the lock on a particular date and time. Then, of course, there are wireless cameras and video doorbells that are becoming popular right now. There's cloud storage, so you don't need videotapes or hard drives anymore. Boards and management team members can access these feeds in the recordings pretty much instantly, and potentially from anywhere, again, if you're using an app on a portable wireless device. Obviously, their presence alone can deter misconduct. When someone who's thinking about engaging in some bad behavior sees these things there, they know they're going to end up on film. That may take away some of their enthusiasm for doing something wrong. They also afford nowadays easier setup than wired systems used to. If you don't have to worry about running wires through the building and through the walls and so on, it becomes a lot easier to obtain these devices and to get them installed. financial considerations. So the technology items at this point still have a higher cost at the outset, especially, you know, than the analog type issues. They may also require community authorization, and that authorization may even apply depending on who you are and where your association is. That authorization may be required by law. For instance, in Massachusetts, Chapter 183A is the Condominium Act, and at Section 18, it talks about improvements. And even something as small as a security camera, which may also, by the way, be inexpensive, you know, nowadays compared to other items. Some of these cameras are sold for, you know, less than $100 sometimes. But notwithstanding how small they might be, how relatively, you know, unintrusive they might be, and how easy they might be to install, how cheap they might be to buy. If your association did not have a security system or security cameras in the past, then adding those items is considered an improvement under the statute. And so there does need to be a community vote that approves that action to be taken, because you're adding a feature to the condominium that wasn't there before. Here's the voting standard as it appears in Chapter 183, Section 18. If 50% or more, but less than 75% of the owners agree to the improvement, then the cost of that improvement shall be borne solely by those owners so agreeing. So that tells us a couple things. If less than 50% vote for an improvement, then that improvement measure has failed. And between 50 and 75%, that improvement can be installed, it can be purchased by the association and installed and put into use, but the bill is going to be paid only by those people who voted for it. The second part of the standard here shows us that 75% or more of the unit owners can agree to make an improvement. And at that point, all of the owners share the expense the way we normally think of with a common expense, meaning everybody's going to pay their portion of the bill. Disadvantages. Of course, there's always a balance. You know, when we get into things like smart locks and internet connected cameras, they can be hacked once that access is achieved by a hacker. They can manipulate those items. There's ransomware attacks out there where you know, they're extorting money from people in order to get their own access back or get their doors unlocked and so on. There have been cases in which video feeds have been hacked, even cases where a perpetrator has communicated through the system with the people on the property, in some cases, you know, harassing the residents that they can see on the camera. Hackers could also try to get into the recordings that are stored on the cloud. So same concerns we have, you know, for our computers, for our personal data, for the information that we have on our computers at our businesses. If we're using the technology devices, we have to keep in mind some sense of security from a technological standpoint so that that information isn't at risk. The conveniences and concerns with respect to smart locks, like we said, the access is improved, it's easier, it's more modern. However, you know, you do have some security concerns, you have some data privacy concerns. It would probably be a good idea at this point for associations, to the extent that they are adopting these items, even if the improvement vote passes, you may want to go ahead and offer the unit owners the individual freedom to opt in or out. And so some people, for instance, if there's going to be a smart lock, some of these locks have, you know, sort of key backups, and you may have owners who want to continue to use a key as opposed to a cell phone to get into the building, even if you have a smart lock in place. That will help you as an association to sort of resolve some of the controversy, between the different factions, if you've got some people that want technology and some that don't. So association pitfalls and liabilities. Obviously, the high-tech solutions, as these things always are a new and developing area. And so it's a little bit unclear how much liability there might be for associations as a result of utilizing this technology if the technology either fails or is successfully hacked. And there's a little notification here, a link. If you Google these issues, or if you go to YouTube, you can Google videos of these issues. And I've seen films of, what can happen when hackers get into these devices and they take them over. So the smart devices, because they are keeping track of the location, the activity, information that's on the network, that they create the potential for a data breach. And then there becomes a serious question again of the association's potential liability if you required unit owners to put their data into a system and then that data was stolen. There were in 2020 4,000 confirmed data breaches in this country. An association might face the same requirements as the data collector in terms of notifying owners of a breach. In other words, in the same way we have seen on the news, sometimes when, like a major credit card company has a data breach and they are required to let all of their cardholders know that there's some risk, it's pretty reasonable to think that if the use of these technologies becomes the norm in associations, that to the extent there's a breach, associations are going to need to be prepared to notify all of the owners that has happened and what their risk might be. So final advice from me with respect to this portion of today's program. I think the best approach is to identify products of interest, assess the pros and cons. Sometimes you have relatively simple consequences. Other times it may be a more complicated issue. Sometimes you might have a fairly low chance of being targeted as a community. Other times, for whatever reason, you might have higher chances. And, an easy, for instance, would be that a upscale Boston condominium is probably presenting as more of a target than, a suburban or rural condominium that's, tucked away in a natural setting. So again, like I said at the outset, what you really want to do is sort of take stock of your own situation and look at those characteristics that exist in your situation in terms of figuring out what's appropriate for you. Where you have greater chances of being targeted and greater consequences if you are targeted, then you may want to pass on a particular product, or you may want to look at a more secure version of that product. Just about all of the products available are available, on some spectrum. And of course, the price, becomes a factor and changes as well. But these devices typically appear on a spectrum where some devices have relatively few features and perhaps lesser security in place, and others have a lot more. The second part of what I consider to be the best approach is to work with an expert in the field, someone who is familiar with these technologies and with these products, and someone who can provide advice and suggestions as to courses of action. Like I've been saying during the course of this seminar today, we are seeing more and more security vendors in the marketplace, and they have more and more experience and expertise, particularly in the latest products and technologies. And so, like I said earlier, in the same way that associations and property managers reach out to the attorneys and the CPAs and the landscapers and all those folks, we're probably reaching that time now where the idea of reaching out to a security vendor who can provide those services in a very specific and professional way is probably something that everybody needs to start looking at now in order to make sure that you have appropriate measures in place for your community. So that brings me to Chris's slides. I'm sure you've heard enough from me at this point, and I am very happy to turn things over now to Christopher Lanni, who, as I said at the outset, is the principal of Secure Residential Services, LLC. He is, in fact, precisely one of these vendors that I'm referencing, and who has that experience and expertise when it comes to these issues. And so he is now going to talk to you about how all of this works from his perspective as a security professional.
Right. Gary, thank you. Great overview and really a lot of great information. So, I do want to touch upon a few things, during the next half hour here or so. I think the first thing I want to talk about is reasonableness. I know during your conversation, you mentioned the word reasonable measures quite a bit. And we need to have a conversation about how do you get to reasonable measures? How do you identify reasonable measures? It's difficult because, reasonable is subjective, right? And what I think might be reasonable and what Gary might think is reasonable, or a judge or a board member or a resident, they can all be very, very different. So we want to talk about the term reasonable and what that really means. I want to give you some tools and some perspective to take with you to your properties to look at what you're doing to see if you are in that kind of reasonable range. And if not, how do we start to move you and your program into that area of being reasonable? And then finally, I want to get back into some of the technology that Gary kind of started the conversation with, just to talk about the fact that they are really common fare and some of the, again, other advantages and disadvantages to using those things. So I think what I'd like to do first is talk real high level about some definitions, just to make sure that we're all talking in the same terms. It's very, very easy to narrowly apply a definition to what is security. I hear folks tell me all the time, I have a security officer, they're from a security company, they're in a security uniform, they're out and around the property doing security things, quote unquote, and therefore I have security. And so I just try to tell people that, if you step back a little bit, and certainly when you look at your property, understand that security comes from many, many different places. It's just not what we just talked about. It's how the property runs, operations, what are your policy procedures, what do you have in place for technology? People, it could be security, it could be a security officer designated for that purpose, but it could be a lot of other folks. It could be your maintenance folks who are out changing lights and making sure door locks are working properly. It could be your landscapers who are taking landscaping back from lighting and door entrances. Front desk folks who are meeting and greeting and screening incoming guests. Your management office who, as Gary talked about, is identifying residents and their vehicles and logging them into a system. So it's many, many different things. So I would encourage you to not focus so narrowly on the definition that we sometimes hear of what security actually really is. So we just talked about, a true security initiative at a property is really wrapped up and made up of those three major components, right? Policy procedures, people, right? The human piece of it, and the technology. And really, when you put all three things together is where you start to achieve that level of reasonable securityness. If you take one of these three things out of the mix, it gets very, very difficult, if not impossible, to really do that. So I'm going to talk about, the technology piece a little bit and some of the kind of procedural stuff and people a little bit, but do step back when you look at your property, understand that, again, it's very, very broad and very much more encompassing than just what you see here. I think that my advice to clients when we first start looking at properties, we start looking at what they have in place, is it's helpful for you to look at your own mindset. Okay, look at how you view that subject of security yourself, for starters, right? We want you to be neutral, we want you to be impartial, and we want you to be open-minded to your property and events that could take place there. And so when I talk to clients, and these are all quotes you see on the screen that I've been told by clients, on many occasions over the years, we don't have security here. We don't have security problems here. Something like this could never happen here. That type of mindset is exceptionally narrowing. And it puts you in a place where it's easy to dismiss things that maybe you should be doing to get you to that reasonable level of security. So do initially, at least for the exercise you're going to be doing at your property, think about how you're perceived and how you're looking at your property and what your own existing mindset might be. Understand, obviously, like we've talked about, and Gary's talked about one major event here, but even this past year, there have been many, many events that have taken place that have security connotations, events that have been made significantly worse or allowed to take place or for a long period of time because security initiatives either weren't in place or they weren't working properly or they were broken. Real quickly talking about the Surfside case in Florida, people identify that as a structural issue, right? It's a case that you had a building that had some decisions to be made, funding to be made, things to happen to try to get the building physically squared away. But the reality is, during the event itself, there were human components involved as well as technology that could have saved lives during that event, right? We know there was an evacuation system in place in the building that wasn't utilized, right, during the event. We know that the folks at the front desk had not been trained. So we know that there are ramifications. So I just would encourage you, as you look at your own property, to keep in mind that it's just not those traditional quote unquote security events you may be talking about. It could in fact be things like you see on the screen that could be exacerbated significantly, by what happens. If you're in doubt, really, you can certainly go to Google. This is what I do every day. Google sends me an email of all security related events, that involve condominiums. Every day I get it. You can set the search up for the way you want to see things. For example, United States only, maybe condominiums only, crime only, and just see for yourself. I mean, it is clearly, clearly a matter of things happen in condominiums. We know that, right? So just be open-minded to that. When you get ready to look at your property, start to take in information, understand what you should be looking at and what you should be doing there. I do encourage folks to get in information, take information in from multiple sources. Okay, it's not an exercise you want to do by yourself in a vacuum, right? I mean, there's information out there available, as Gary talked about. Legal counsel will have some thoughts for you about what you should and should not be doing. Your insurance carriers will absolutely have some thoughts of what you should and should not be doing. Your condominium documents, Gary talked about that. Your docs will tell you, who owns door locks, who owns windows. Are there some special circumstances specific to security spelled out in documents you should look at? Anytime I do work at a property, the first thing I do is take a look at the documents to help me understand the landscape and understand where the ownership is. Independent consultants like myself can simply provide perspective. We see a lot of properties that do it well. We see properties that don't do it well. So we can bring another set of eyes to you, and again, for information to provide and help. Same thing with local police departments. Product representatives, folks who do installations, folks who represent manufacturers, they're a wealth of information. I use them myself, to understand what can this technology do, what are its benefits, what are its drawbacks, what are some of its requirements. It's an information source that's available to you at any time. I really recommend that you use it. Peer network, we're going to get into community standard here in a few minutes, but peers, how folks do it at other buildings, has an immense amount of value. We talk about doing comps, right, for real estate purchases and setting condo fees sometimes or services levels fees sometimes. And it's really no different in security. I mean, you've got to make sure you're doing a fair comp, right? Is the building you're talking to similar in nature and layout and content and demographic as yours? But certainly understanding what folks are doing, how they're doing it, how it's working. Is it working well? Is it challenging? Again, is a stream of information that you should be gathering while you're looking at your program. Academically, there are guidelines, standards, best practices. CAI has a document that's specific to security. Best practices, there's academic material out there that is worth taking a look at least, just to understand, again, from the academic perspective, what is talked about and what should be happening. And then obviously, if you're working with management companies, they deal with this issue every day, right? All their properties to some level. So there are many resources available to you to use. I would encourage you to bring that information into the conversation you're having yourself, your board, your residents, et cetera, to start to make some decisions. So additional things, I guess I bring this slide in only because this gives you some more perspective in terms of what I do when I come out to a property. There are things that I'm going to look at that, again, gain some perspective and help us understand what you're doing, if it's appropriate, if it's reasonable, et cetera. One is incident history, and Gary talked about this as well. Properties need to have a way to answer the question as to what goes on in their own property, right? So if I ask any of you in this group, have you had any events over the last year or 2 years or 3 years? And I'll just tell you that the methodology calls for a 3-year review, 3 to 5 years of internal data from the property in terms of incident history. So one of the questions we would ask is, what happens at your property? Do you have things happening in your garage and in other common spaces? Have you had other crimes and things take place? you have to have a system in place to allow you to answer those questions, right? It could be very, very simple, a very simple reporting program. I have clients that have no staff on site. I have clients with a tremendous amount of staff on site. There are ways to develop a reporting program, right? It could be simple through email, through a web page. You could see your front desk. You could call into an anonymous phone line. I mean, there are many, many ways you can configure that, but you've got to make sure you know what's going on in your own space to some degree, number one. So police departments. So police departments have calls for data service, right? We can go and we can ask them, tell us every time a police car has been dispatched to a certain address, right? Over the last 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Same thing with the area surrounding your property. What's happening in your area for crime? You know, the standard which you're going to be measured by is that you either should have known, right? You knew or should have known, right? So you can't say, well, I just didn't know that we had problems in our building. I didn't know we had trespassing events happening. I didn't know we were surrounded in an area that was having major events happening. I just didn't know that. That's not going to get you through a claim. So, you know, pulling data from local police and for your own inside sources is vital. It's if you're not doing it, you really need to start doing it. Part of what I do, as Gary talked about, is I do a risk assessment. When we come to your property, we want to see, you know, what types of events could happen, right? You know, are they likely? Are they unlikely? Are they possible? Are they plausible? Do they have a significant impact on the property? A very minor impact? We want to understand, again, what your exposures are. We do a site survey to tell us what's on your property. What do you currently have in place? Are you using cameras? Are you using keys? Are you using key fobs? Are you using policy procedures or staffing in any combination to address those risks and those exposures and those potential events? Community standard, again, you know, when I work on cases, you know, we look at properties and we understand what are similar properties doing for fill in the blank, right? How do they handle guests? How do they handle vehicles? How do they handle access control? How do they handle response to incidents on site? And, you know, those dialogues you have with peers is part of that, right? So how are people doing things? The community standard is part of what you're going to be measured against. So you should make sure you have some understanding of what's happening in similar properties. And then really finally, tolerances. And this is a little bit vague, and this is kind of my own, you know, my own take on things, but every building, right? Every property, every association, they have a tolerance. Okay. It could be simple as financial. You know, as Gary said, you know, there are cameras that are $50, right? There are $500 cameras. There are $5,000 cameras. So there's a tolerance in there somewhere. Some buildings have a lot of staff. Some have a minimal staff. Some have no staff. Again, there's a tolerance in there. Building operations, you can accommodate certain things if your operation in the building allows for it. But those are all things to take into consideration. Those are tolerances. You know, we could build a building, we could make it exceptionally high security, you know, like an airport or, you know, a bank or whatever, but no one would want to live there, right? There's a tolerance you've exceeded, you know, that folks will struggle with. So we try to make sure that we're at least cognizant of these tolerances as we start to look at recommendations and suggestions to resolve issues. So, and Gary talked a little bit about this as well, but let me just kind of reiterate that, you know, when you evaluate what you should be doing, if you're thinking about introducing a measure, whether it's a policy, whether it's technology or whatever that might be, the reality is, you know, you've got to start with what the problem is, right? What is the need? What is the issue? What are we trying to solve? Sometimes I get in conversations with clients and we rush to the other end, right? We rush to what's the solution? Well, let's put a camera up. Let's do this. Let's put up some signage. Let's put a thing in our newsletter. And so all those things may be part of your solution. But I do try to tell people, let's start with what the actual problem is. So let's say we have an amenity space that's being used when it should be used, or it's being vandalized, or it's getting into by folks who shouldn't be there, right? So we can very specifically identify what the problems are, right? What we're trying to accomplish. We want to understand access to the space. We want to control access to the space. If we have an event, we want to go back and look and see who was in the space. We can actually identify some very, very, very specific needs that we're hoping to accomplish with what we're going to do. The next thing is to look at the solution, right? So while we could put a camera in place, we could, you know, again, we could put a fob reader in place or a combination code in place, and we could talk about what each of those things will do for us, right? The cameras would give us a sense of who's using space, right, at any given time. Key fobs or access cards or punch code will tell us who entered a space at a certain time. And so we have to evaluate, you know, will that give us the answers? And will that give us enough information we need to either deter the behavior, stop the behavior, or if it takes place, at least understand what's taking place, right? So it's kind of this balancing act. And then really the kind of the last piece there is, you know, when you look at your tolerances, you know, will those things work in a tolerance? Well, I mean, you know, let's talk about the community room. If we lock the community room 24/7 and a person has to wait for a staff person to become free to get to the room and finally let them in for their event and set up, it's not going to work, right? Operationally, that's not going to work. That tolerance will be broken, right? So we have to figure out a way that works. If your residents carry key fobs already, Maybe the community room goes on a key fob, right? Reader. So maybe that reader is set to go on certain times of the day when the space can be used. Maybe it's set to be on 24/7. But again, there are ways to address those needs with the various tools, but you want to really make sure that your expectation is clear and what the solution will do for you is clear. Because a lot of the calls I get from clients is that, well, we put cameras in and we're still having problems, or we put this in and we can't seem to understand what's going on, and we missed the mark. So just some thoughts about how to proceed if you're going to look at certain measures. The long view, I talk to folks about this a lot. It's very, very common when we go to a site and we look at technology, we're going to put cameras in place or an access control system in place. And, we go out and we do the RFP and we have vendors come in and we do the installation and we do the program and we're all done. It's the system's in place and everyone's happy. There's an understanding that maybe that's kind of the end of the process, right? We're done, right? We've accomplished that. But I try to instill in people that the reality is things have really only begun there, right? Because all of these systems have needs going forward. We've got to come up with initial funding to make those purchases. All the things we're going to talk about pretty much, whether it's staffing, whether it's technology, et cetera, they all have ongoing maintenance costs, or they should. I often ask properties, talk to me about your operating budget. How much money do you have allotted for camera repairs or for maintenance, et cetera? And often the answer is none, right? If we need it, we'll call, but we don't really put any money aside. So that's not going to be the case. And then finally, replacement, right? These systems have a lifespan, right? So often I end up at a client site where we've got a system that's getting ready to fail. There is no comparable replacement for it. There are no parts available for it. We have to have a replacement system to the tune of whatever, $35,000, let's say, and there's been no money put aside. There's no plan to carry on that system once it gets to end of life. So there are some financial implications, long view, but then there was also the procedural part and some of the resources part. Key fob systems. You have to be prepared to have a person on staff who will have their hands in that system, right? That system requires ongoing care. Chris Lanni lives here. Let's get Chris Lanni a key fob. Let's program it. Let's get it to him. Let's make sure he signs a document to receive it, et cetera. Chris Lanni's lease is expired. He's getting ready to move out. Let's make sure we go in and shut that key fob off. Or, there is some engagement with all of these systems. Video systems, same thing. We had an event. We need somebody to go in and pull video. We need to take a look and see if the system's running properly and doing what it should. And so there is this ongoing resource that's going to be needed for all the things we're talking about. Sometimes things get put in place and clients say, well, we don't have anybody here who can work with us for, let's say 1,000 residents to turn key fobs on and off. You'd be surprised. That becomes kind of a part-time job. And those of you who are in big buildings know that that's part of what you do if you're doing it right. And it's really is a requirement. Ongoing evaluation, I'm going to talk about at the very end. But, again, these systems get put into place under one set of circumstances. And as time goes on, things change, your risk change, your exposure changes, your resident need changes, et cetera. And with that, there will be adjustments to these systems. And that's just part of kind of its maintenance and ongoing care. So I'm going to get more into that as I get to the end here. So security related technology. So we have electronic access control systems like we talked about a little bit earlier, key fobs, access cards, vehicle transponders, et cetera, right? Video cameras, electronic key control systems, which I want to get a little bit of detailing because I think that's a very big area right now that people need to be keenly aware of. Telephone entry systems, silent alarms, so duress alarms, silent alarms, panic alarms, and then emergency call stations. I'll touch upon all these here relatively quickly and we'll save some time here for Q&A. But access control, as we heard earlier, a metal key is a metal key. I give you a metal key, you leave with that metal key. What you do with it from there is kind of up to the user, right? We're going to hope you're going to hold on to it. We're going to hope that you're going to use care with it. We're going to hope you don't have it duplicated. We're going to hope you don't give it to other people to use, et cetera. The problem is, as a managing agent, or a member of the board or a consultant, whomever, I have no way now of controlling that key once it goes out. So when Chris Lanni no longer lives here, and Chris Lanni still has his key to the front door, what do? Right? You're going to rekey the building every time a resident key goes with a resident or gets lost, gets misplaced. No, it doesn't really work that way. And that's why those key systems, traditional metal key systems, really are not the standard and really do not work, even in small communities. Key fobs, like I said, access cards, transponders, mobile credentials on your phone, as we heard about, biometric systems for fingerprinting, pins, right? Numeric pins, et cetera. A lot of versatility. And really what's nice about it is it gives you the ability to really control, where does a person get into? When can they get into a certain space? Do we know who is in a certain space at a certain time? It's just really a tool that helps you run the building and also helps you solve all these little mysteries that go on in your sites from time to time, along with video. So there are a lot of different types of access control programs out there. Some are on site, right? So you've got a server on site and your software is on site and everything you do is on site. Some of it is hosted, right? So it's in the cloud somewhere and everything you do is remote. And then there are systems that are kind of hybrid. It's a little of each. And there are considerations there throughout all those options. Privacy concerns, ongoing financial concerns. So you need to evaluate each one of those to see what's best for you. Small buildings, minimal staff, minimal overhead, not a lot of IT support available. Does it make sense to go to a hosted system? Maybe. We need to look at the financial part of it and see if it made sense. But so there are options to truly be evaluated. Real-time door condition reporting. I want to spend a minute or two on this because this is really an important one that folks tend to miss. These systems will give you the ability to understand what's happening in your property at all times in terms of doors, right? Entrance doors, stairwell doors, perimeter doors, garage doors, dock doors, etc. These systems allow us to understand if a door is open or closed. It helps us understand if the door has been forced open from the outside. It can tell us if a door is being held open, right? Being chalked open, it just hasn't fully closed due to a mechanical failure. And it gives you a real-time stream of information that you really can't get any other way unless you're going to put a person out there looking at every single door continuously, which you're not going to do, right? So make sure when you're looking at systems, or if you have your own system in place right now, that you're using that feature. They can send out text messages, they can send out emails, they can do notifications, audio notifications, they can do pop-ups on screens in front of staff if you've got that. It helps you understand what's happening in your place. How would you ever describe, or explain to a jury that you have staff at the front desk and your dock door was wide open all night long and really no one noticed it and someone walked in, right? So this system will help you deal with those issues before they become problematic. So really make sure you're using that as a feature and investigating if you're not using it. Creative deployment, right? So these systems can really be configured to do a lot of different things. So, during COVID, we had a client who was using key fob readers on the outside of the fitness center as well as the inside of the fitness center. And the system was smart enough to understand how many people were in that space based on the key fob swipes, right? So 5 people come in, 5 swipes, 5 people go out, 5 swipes. The system knows what the balance is. So if you limit the number of people in a space at a certain time, you do it through technology, right? You can use it for package storage. I've got plenty of sites who use individual secured spaces for packages that could be accessed by residents during certain times, to collect packages. There's a lot of ways to use the technology very, very creatively to help you with issues. Policy procedures, we don't really have the time, depth to get into here, but I really recommend folks have very, very clear policies, procedures on what they're doing and how they're doing it, right? How are you issuing key fobs? How many key fobs can I have? Can my family have key fobs? How do we handle door alarms that come in? All those things that, regard to the system. How do we maintain the system? Who audits the system, et cetera? Make sure you've got a policy in place. It's written, it's followed, so everyone's on the same page. And customizable user authorizations. Again, not all users have to do the same thing. So you can have a front desk set up to do certain things. A management office could do certain things. A board member could do certain things. Very, very customizable, very, very user-friendly. Video camera networks, at the end of the day, when I talk to clients, it's about usable images, right? We want to understand, is your video system creating a usable image? And by that, I mean, can I go to your system right now and take an image off that system, look at the picture of the person coming in your front door, give it to the police, and can they identify that person based on that image? Yes or no? It's as simple as that. Analog technology, older technology has a threshold. It can only give you so much resolution, right? Under the best of circumstances. There are still a lot of analog systems out there, right? And so for some applications, maybe you can get away with them. Very close, small vestibule, deadhead shot, straight ahead, very lighting, very controlled. Maybe it works. Generally speaking, analog's not going to get you the level of clarity you need to have, right? So IP technology is what is most commonly used now, will bring you to that level of resolution so you can make use of the images you're collecting, right? Why have a system? Why pay for maintenance? Why have staff using technology that's not producing a usable product at the end of the day? So again, I would make sure your images are clear as they can be with what you've got. And if not, investigate the upgrade. Same thing with access control here, right? On-site, hosted, off-site, some hybrid. Again, there are benefits, drawbacks to each. They're all worth looking at. Some have applications in some places that work, others do not. So again, it's kind of a personal site-by-site feature. Remote monitoring. I have clients who have no staff on site, but they have a video system. and they use an outside monitoring service. There's a monitoring service in California that's looking at your property and making observations and taking action, right? Calling the police, calling the property manager if they see something that's out of the ordinary. So there are ways to get around this kind of stuff. And getting a creative deployment, same thing. How you use cameras on your property will depend site to site, but again, get creative with the stuff. You can solve a lot of problems with it.
Chris?
Yep.
Want to interrupt real quick to announce to the folks that are on here that we do have the platform until 2:30. So I mentioned at the outset that we would have time for Q&A, and as we approach 2 o'clock, I just want to make sure that people are aware that we have the platform until 2:30. So we will still have time to address questions once the presentation is concluded.
All right. Thank you, and I'll try to get us through here so we can make sure we've got some time. Related to video cameras, also, analytics. I mean, it's very, very important to understand, a video camera system is, considered typically a forensic tool, right? It gathers information for you to go back and look at after the fact. People talk about, well, I want to have a person sitting in front of a monitor 24/7, watching all my cameras, make sure nothing happens. There are some problems with that, right? I mean, aside from the fact that it's incredibly expensive, aside from the fact that humans only have the ability to watch for so long before they become ineffective, right? We've academically tested that. We've seen that there's a pretty high fail rate after about 20 minutes. So that doesn't really work. Analytics are software, right? It's software that sits on your video system that tells you, hey, something is going on here you need to be aware of real time. It can tell you the flow of traffic. You've got an entranceway that's egress only. The video camera sees a person come in that door rather than out. It can alert you real time. It can tell you, hey, you know what, something's going on here. You better take a look before it becomes an issue. So people counting, the direction of folks coming and going, license plate recognition, again, same thing. These higher level tools now become really real time and interactive rather than this passive sitting back and let's just see if we need it, we'll take a look, but who knows? So analytics also are becoming very reasonably priced. At one point, an analytic camera with software was an exceptionally exorbitant amount of money, and that's just not the case anymore. If it's planned for in advance at the time of the purchase, the marginal increase is really not that much. So it's something you should look at if you're not already using some analytics to think about if they apply to your space. Rest of the items here I'm going to hold off on. I think pretty much we cover the same idea in the in electronic access control. So let's see. Telephone entry system, again, very high level, resident driven access into the building, right? In a vestibule at the front of the building. It could be a push button intercom. It could be a actual app on a phone. It could be a video connection, but allows folks to meet and greet and screen incoming visitors to the building and provide them access. As a security consultant, not my favorite thing. It's a little bit hard, because now you're giving residents the ability to open the door. The first thing I do when I go to a building, I go to that system and I see how many buttons I have to push before someone lets me in the building, because inevitably someone lets me in the building and I shouldn't be there, right? So there's some problems there, and I don't always look forward to having folks have those, but at a minimum, you got to make sure it's working properly. You've got to make sure that it has an audit trail, right? It has a transaction history. You'd be surprised how many of those systems out there don't actually keep track of what unit was called at what time, and if the door is released or not, right? So you've got to have to make sure that if you're going to have a system like this, you're at least doing that, so if you have an event, how did that person get in the building, right? You look at video, you look at the transaction history, and you kind of go from there. It also gives you some flexibility in terms of resident directories. I kind of cringe when I go into a lobby and there's a giant board in the front line with all the residents' names and their unit numbers right in the middle of the whole world to see. And I kind of get a little shaky about when I see that. So I do kind of tell people, modern telephone directory systems give you the ability to do different types of resident directories. First name, last name only, initials only, unit number only, let's say. So there are ways to get away from telling the whole world who lives in the building, which is of interest to some parties. Silent and panic alarms, duress alarms, etc., becoming very, very common. So you've got a front desk that's staffed 24/7. You've got someone on the front desk by themselves in the middle of the night. They have a problem. How do they use someone's help, right? How do they get assistance without making the situation worse, right? You're dealing with someone like Gary was talking about, who is obviously having some type of an episode. You can't just tell that person, just hold on a second, I need to just call the police, I'll be right with you, right? That's going to make things significantly worse. So these panic alarms, silent alarms, they can either be wired at a desk or at an office, or they can be wireless, something you hold in your hand, will summons help for you in the event you're having a major event. Multiple PI notifications, you push that button, The police could be notified, your property manager could be notified, board members, et cetera. It gives you some flexibility. And I typically tell folks, they're becoming the norm now. Think about their use at your property. Obviously, if you're going to deploy them with training. Just don't put it out there and say, just push the button if you have a problem and this button will solve all your issues, because it doesn't work that way, right? So it'll summons help, but there's some other discussion there about awareness and engagement and personal safety. So again, great tool, and we're seeing more and more of it come out and around. Emergency call stations, something you've seen, I'm sure, in parking lots, in parking garages, typically areas that are considered communication dead zones. Your cell phone might not work that well. Some kind of a call station with a push button, usually a blue beacon. It allows folks to summons help if they have a need, right? It's becoming very, very common in residential buildings and residential garages. And it's a tool that I really recommend folks look at and assess and see if it's appropriate. If you're going to be having it on site, you've got to make sure you understand how it works. You got to make sure your residents understand how it works. You also have to understand that there's a piece there about response, right? Who responds to that? So I've got clients who have emergency call stations go back to their front desk. And I kind of say, well, there's some problems with that, right? Is that person going to be at the front desk every single minute of every single shift, every single day? Probably not. So that may not be a great idea. It goes out to a monitoring center. They can actually see what's going on. They can see your cameras. They can actually answer an alarm if it gets pushed, and they can send help. So there are ways to get around that. But I would say if you have areas that are dead zones, that cell phones are not working in, that are remote, that are desolate, and if you don't have emergency call stations in place, it's something you should really, really consider having at your property. And again, we talked about this earlier. I'm not going to really beat you to death, but systems are put in place and programs are put in place at a point in time, right? And they're really not set it and forget it, right? It's something that's going to require ongoing evaluation. Is it working? Is it doing what we're hoping it would do? Is it meeting the needs of the building, which could be different tomorrow or next week or next month or next year? Things change, like we talked about. Approaches change, technology changes, risk change, your demographic changes. And with that, you need to make sure you're changing your program to make sure it's appropriate what's going on. I tell people very often that post-incident, a review of a small event, somebody get into a space they shouldn't been into, or you've got an area that's being used, or a small vandalism issue that wasn't really bad, but it took place. Use that as a way to go through a forensic, right? Go through your systems. What worked? What didn't work? What would have worked to have prevented that event from taking place? And use those small events to help you from having a bigger event, to make sure the tools and things you have in place are working properly. And when you do that exercise, come up with a punch list, right? Come up with a list of actions, very specific actions. We need to look at cameras. Our cameras aren't clear enough. We don't have camera coverage in these couple of areas that we really should. Have a very decisive plan and apply it and get to work and get those things done, because over time, it's probably not going to get better by itself. So I rushed a little bit to get us through. I hope that was helpful, but I do want to try to answer questions if there are folks who have questions here that they submitted.
Yeah, I'm going to take a look at the list. There were definitely some submitted. We'll see. Some of them I think were answered. Real quick, there was someone who asked about, 3/4 glass doors and the potential risk that they present. And Chris, you're the security expert, but I will just say this much. I know that like with a lot of products, there's a spectrum of glass. So, right. You've got your glass that you poke a hole in with your elbow, all the way up to, even bulletproof glass. But I would defer to you on what you think makes for a good door, or how to look at glass doors.
Sure. I mean, so it's a great question. It raises a great concern, to your point. There's glass that can withstand some pretty heavy hits, and there's some glass that really cannot. So I think it comes down to is, I tell clients all the time, let's not talk about one specific item, right? Let's talk about the glass in your door only. Let's talk about the bigger program you have in place. If that door is breached, if I get to your building, I knock your glass out of the door and I get into the front door, what happens from there? Where can I go, right? Is your elevator controlled? Are there other stairwells controlled in some fashion? What happens once I get past that door? I think the other question I would ask is, let's talk about the history in the area, right? So I've got clients who are on known protest routes, right? Places where we've had vandalism come through, Newbury Street, for example, and do damage to client buildings, right? So we know it's a possibility. So does filming a window so it's not as easy to knock out or can't be breached, does that make sense for those type of clients? Yeah, it sure does. I think that, but again, I would take the folks step back a little bit, look at your program overall. What are you doing? How are you dealing with things overall, and see what makes sense. But certainly there are ways to address glass doors and glazing with security film. It's not that expensive, really.
Okay, excellent. Just looking through these questions, trying to find things that weren't answered. We also have some comments that we appreciate that are not questions, but one question was what we think the legal decision would be in a case where an intruder entered a garage, but the door was operating properly, but an authorized vehicle was entering or exiting, and the intruder at that point was able to sneak in. So kind of hard to predict what a particular case decision might be, and it might vary based on the judge or the location and the court involved. But I would say that in any given case, nowadays, especially, and we see this from the case I talked about at the beginning, the field case, I think they're going to look at sort of the totality of the circumstances. So if the door was working properly and someone, made the effort and timed things just right, and during a time of, legitimate use of the door, managed to sneak in there, I don't think that an association is going to be found to be particularly at fault for that. I think what would happen in such a case is that the focus would turn to what are the other aspects of the association's security. And so once that person snuck in, where could they go from there? And were there more weak points after that that allowed them to cause some harm? And what type of harm did they cause? And was that foreseeable in some way? So, if things were working properly, I guess to try to sum it up, if things were working properly, I don't think the association is going to be particularly at fault because someone managed to sneak in a door or an entry that was operating appropriately. But I do think now that will, of course, implicate an analysis of the overall security of the building and whether anything else was there to stop them from committing harm.
Yeah, Gary, exactly. And when I talk to clients, exactly we talk about the totality, right? The totality of everything you have in place, right? Does it make sense? And if you've got an area that has a problem, how is it backed up by other measures you have in place? Just like you said. So yeah, totally, exactly what I advise clients.
So there's an interesting question here about key fobs. They're being considered by an association who recently had a meeting where residents stood up and voiced an opposition to key fobs. Statement was made that they offended or violated some, I believe this is religious. It looks like there was a typo, and I think it was religious beliefs because it looks like the word religious just missing the G only. So that's a first for me. You again, I'm sure have more experience with these particular items, Chris, but have you heard of anybody claiming that a key fob violated a religious belief?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think back in all the projects we've done. I don't think I've had that conversation. I mean, I think you're left with using a metal key in one hand to open a door, right? To physically engage the door itself, or a key fob. I have not had that come up as a conversation in any of the projects I've done in the last 25 years. So it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I haven't encountered it.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of follow-up question is whether or not that's a legitimate concern. And I wouldn't call anybody's religious belief illegitimate or to say that there should be no concern about it. But I think that to the extent that one owner within a shared community is trying to assert a belief that isn't acknowledged a record that nobody else has heard of, I don't know that that's going to be enough to stop, a project, especially if that project has been voted upon by the requisite percentage of the community to be putting it in place.
Right.
That might be an instance in which you want to allow someone to opt out if possible. Give them an alternative, depending on what exactly that issue is. And I've never heard of it either, so I don't know the specifics, but depending on exactly what that issue might be, perhaps there might be a workaround for that person.
And that's what some of the feedback we're getting right now coming in is actually saying exactly that. There could be some religious related to the Sabbath, and then kind of resident workaround with metal keys, et cetera. So yeah, so something to consider. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
There's actually another great question here, Gary, regarding getting residents to comply, right? To get folks to comply with safety procedures, such as, who gets into the building and letting someone in the front door, et cetera, while it's open. So great question. Again, this is kind of the people part of what I was talking about, the human piece of it all. And we spend a lot of time with this with boards and with clients, because most of these programs rely on folks to kind of be on the same page, right? To all understand that, you're in a community, you're trying to engage and you want to be courteous and polite to your neighbors. But in the same token, holding a door open for someone who you don't know creates some problems, right? It certainly could potentially cause some issues. So how do you strike that balance between those two things? So I typically tell people, one thing I tell people, if you get to a front door of your building and there's someone there who you don't know trying to get in the building, you have the option of just doing a flyby. Like, you don't have to stop and engage that person and go in the door. You don't have to force your way in. You can simply do a pass by and see what goes on there, see what that person's status is before you take any action. I think that, it's also not uncommon. I don't ask people to heavily engage, but like in the retail industry years ago, when I was very, very young in security, there's this whole thing about customer engagement, right? You get into a department store, and a clerk would immediately ask you, "Hi, can I help you in some way?" et cetera, et cetera. And that acknowledgement was about customer service, but it was also about security. It was letting that person know that there's someone here with you, that you're being watched, I'm here. And so the other thing I typically do when I go to a site is I walk around a little bit and see how long it takes for someone to engage me, right? In a very polite way. "Hey, how you doing today? Can I help you? Do you need some directions? Are you all set?" I'm 6'4", I'm a big guy. I don't blend in at all anywhere, right? So usually it takes not too long for someone to kind of look at me and say, "I don't know if this guy really belongs here or not," but it is a good test. And it is part of the awareness I do with clients and with residents to say, it's okay to not let someone in the building. It's okay not to hold an elevator to someone who you don't know. Those things are okay. You're not being rude. You are trying to be part of the security initiative in the building, and it's going to only be successful with your engagement and with your input. And it's sometimes it's a hard thing, but it works. You can get enough people on board where it makes a difference for sure.
I'm going to try to answer two of these pretty quickly. Someone asks if we think it would increase or decrease an HOA's risk to survey owners about options and what they want to do about security. I don't know, from a legal perspective anyway, I don't think it would have much of an effect, particularly because the owners of the building, while their opinion may be important within the community and to the board who's serving that community, those folks may not have any credentials or qualifications or knowledge or expertise about security in general. And so it certainly shouldn't be the end all be all for the board, because I think if the board is ever getting judged on whether or not their course of action was reasonable, I think at some point the board is going to need to consult someone such as yourself, Chris, who is qualified in the field of security, and to get those thoughts and opinions,
Right.
On what options exist.
Right.
Yep.
And real quickly, man, I've seen, associations who have gone out and formed a committee and got some input from residents and let them be part of the process. And so there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I think it's got to be realistic and it's got to be relevant. You can't, let that group decide what you're going to do, what you're not going to do as a board, right? You can't give that responsibility to somebody else, right? You've got to, take it into consideration. I will also tell you that, sometimes we go into buildings and make these changes, we're making a philosophical change. It's like there's a cultural change in the building, because now we're locking things up and we're requiring residents to do certain things. And so it can be a little bit of push and pull. I will tell you that you will have a higher success rate if you can get resident buy-in early on. And so that communication, the participation, the discussions, again, if it's appropriate, to bring people in. And I've done some surveys on sites before with clients for sure. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? What works for you? Do you feel comfortable here? Would you use use a key fob rather than a key, just to get some input from folks. I think it's to be taken into consideration, but I would just be careful, I think, Gary, to your point, how you use that information. That's all.
Okay, possibly related question here. Someone's wondering how to get contact information for security experts who would work with buildings in, for instance, Cambridge and Boston. So I will point out, of course, that Chris, you are one of these folks. Your info has been on the screen today. And as an additional resource, and this is a real go-to answer within the condominium world, we always say that people can check with CAI, which, if there's anyone out there who's not familiar, that's the Community Associations Institute. They are a nationwide nonprofit, but we are in this area part of the New England chapter. In addition to having information at the ready when CAI is contacted, they produce a book. Maybe I'm not going to be able to get this in focus, but they produce a book on an annual basis that's actually a resource directory of all types of professionals who specialize in working with condominiums and associations as their clientele. So that would be another resource as well. Several questions, I think, about smart doorbells, and these tend to come up a lot. This would be like things like the Ring, and boards often wonder, can we grant a unit owner a request for one of these or not? We know that other unit owners are going to complain about being on camera and that, it's going to invade their privacy, or that they're going to be surveilled. So from a legal perspective, I can tell you that with respect to the invasion of privacy claim, generally speaking, the legal standard is whether or not a person had a reasonable expectation of privacy in the area that they were filmed. And if someone is walking down the sidewalk out in public in plain view, and that's where they're captured on a Ring doorbell, or if they're on someone else's walkway or front stairs, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy there. So it really isn't a privacy issue from a legal standpoint. The courts have gone so far as to say that if your balcony where you live is visible from the street, where people are not trespassing, but they can see you on your balcony, you don't even have privacy, a reasonable expectation of privacy, as you exist on your own balcony there. So privacy, not so much an issue. What I would say to boards is that once you start getting these requests, they're going to continue to come. Once you allow someone to get a Ring, you're going to hear from their neighbor on the right who wants a Ring and their neighbor on the left who wants a Ring. So I would say get ahead of it with a policy so that you can be consistent about what you're doing from unit owner to unit owner, and also have an agreement in place, because for the most part at a condominium, when that Ring is installed, it's going on, an exterior wall of the building where unit owners normally don't have a right to be making holes and screwing things in or what have you. So have an agreement in place that protects the association, so that you're making the unit owner responsible for their Ring. They're responsible for anything that happens as a result of it being there. If someone does have an issue who ends up, on the camera, you want to be telling them that if they ever remove it, that they have to restore that area of the exterior of the building to its prior condition, fill in screw holes, etc. You want to make them liable if the screws that they put into the building for some reason, allow water infiltration that causes damage. Basically, even when you grant them permission, you want them to be signing off on an agreement that is full of terms that protect the association as well.
Yep. A couple of good questions, Gary, about technology that's failing, right? Garage doors that fail. It takes time to get service out to put them in place, and how do we deal with that? So I guess, maybe just a step back for a second. I think that, this question can really be well versed in a lot of different ways. If we're talking about a pedestrian door, or a perimeter door, a garage door, a loading dock door, anything that's going to fail, that's going to move your building from being controlled, right, access control, to being open, right, requires action, requires immediate action. You know, to say the dock door is broken today, so we're going to leave it up all day, that's not going to fly, right? So you've got to figure out how to deal with it. So, you know, who's a service provider? What is their general response time? Are they available 24/7? Do you have direct access to parts, to routine maintenance parts, either on site or through your vendor? Do you have access to staffing, right? I've got several clients who use your contracted uniform staffing on an on-call basis. If a door breaks that can't be secured immediately, they bring a person in to conduct access control to make sure the integrity of the building stays whole while that door is out of service. And again, fill in the blank: dock door, loading dock door, pedestrian door, etc. I just think that if you've got a situation where you now have decreased your level of security for a period of time and not addressed it, you leave yourself open to try to explain that should you have a problem in the property. And Murphy works in a way that you're probably gonna have a problem when that happens. So really to take action and have money set aside and a budget in place that would support the maintenance of all that stuff is really, really important.
There's another question here that's, I think, related to some of the Ring doorbell questions. Ultimately, they're asking what the legal position is with respect to cameras that are in common areas that potentially face resident units. And again, you know, the legal standard is, do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in the place where you were observed? And so I would say it's something to look at on a case-by-case basis. If a camera in the common area is simply pointing at the exterior of a unit and someone is now, you know, visible to that camera because they've come out of their unit and they're walking, you know, down the walkway or the sidewalk or the common lawn, I don't think that there's an issue. If we're talking about a situation where somehow that camera is possibly seen through a window, capturing a person inside their unit, I think it's a very different circumstance now, where certainly one could make the argument that, you know, if I'm inside my house and haven't left, I have a reasonable expectation of privacy there. At the end of the day, you know, it partly depends again on what the locale is, what the laws are, and, you know, what judge you draw on a given day. But I wonder if, you know, the type of judge who said that, you know, these people did not have an expectation of privacy on their own balcony, which, by the way, the case in point, the balcony was like the backyard. It wasn't the front yard. But the judge determined that because you could see someone on that balcony from a public road without trespassing, that there was no expectation of privacy there. I wonder to what extent a judge might look at the particulars of a case and say, well, you know, if you've got a bay window or a picture window that's at ground level on the first floor of the building, and, you know, you want privacy, you might need to do something in terms of window coverings or whatever. It can't just be an open, visible area. Can't be an open area of visibility to the outside world. And then, you know, you say you have privacy. Those kind of details, I suspect, would occur on a more case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I would also add, Gary, you know, from a technology perspective, cameras of a commercial grade, I don't mean commercial buildings, but of a manufactured high level, producer, those cameras have the ability to do digital masking, right? Where you can go in and you can block out areas that are visible within the camera's view. You can actually block them out, so they are actually not being seen and not being recorded. So we've actually used that in some installations just to let people know that, yep, we understand, yep, it's entrance to your door, not a problem. We're trying to get the trash room. Our intent is to see what's happening in and out of that space, but we can actually mask off the door to your unit so it actually cannot be seen, show the resident, and they're fine. So there are ways to deal with it as well from technology.
Excellent. So looking at one now, it says if a board member is responsible for the wireless camera system, is that the board's ultimate responsibility for the community security? And I would say that this is probably another that's been spoken to in the sense that, and you can correct me, Chris, if I'm wrong, or certainly add to this, but my take on what you've presented today is that you have a holistic approach to this, meaning that a security professional is going to analyze the property and the circumstances of the property and make a determination about what's reasonable there. And it's probably unlikely that, one camera system is going to be the beginning and the end of the recommendations. And so I think, and again, feel free to jump in, but I think the answer to this question is that, what the board's ultimate responsibility is for the best interest of the community is to make sure you have a reasonable security package in place. And a reasonable security package is in all likelihood gonna be a list of items, after a professional has evaluated the property.
Yeah, no, totally right. Totally right. And again, it's going to be different from door to door, right? Address to address, and right. And so I think as long as you look at the bigger picture, I think you'll be well served. And again, I would just suggest that, it's not common to see properties with full-time live monitoring of cameras. It just is not. I mean, even the biggest properties in Boston, if they have a security command center, quote unquote, it's a shared service, right? They're watching cameras, but they're doing other stuff as well. So the idea of having someone dedicated watching is probably not realistic. And I think to Gary's point, let's look at what you're doing overall at the site, not just for your cameras only.
Again, some of these, in the interest of time, I'm glossing over because I think they've been spoken to. Although I will say, and we typically say this to attendees at seminars, feel free, to reach out to us as the presenters. If you have a question after this about something that we've said, I know I'd be happy to speak to anything that I've said, and I imagine, Chris, you would as well.
I certainly would. Yep.
There is one I see, though, that I think would be particularly well suited to you within your knowledge base. And someone's asking about options that might be available with respect to buildings that don't have internet signal in common areas. And does that mean that they are limited to the physical keys if they can't use the internet in the common areas?
All right. So there are a number of products out there, and I'm going to assume we're talking about unit access specifically, not common areas, but I guess it could apply either way, right? So there are many systems out there that will run independently, right? They don't require the internet 24/7 to stay live and stay current. They're freestanding locks. They get their information from the credential being used from location to location. There are a number of manufacturers who do that. So you don't absolutely have to have internet connectivity, and not every single door has to be wired. There are obviously some benefits and drawbacks, right? Cost and wiring and that type of thing. But you can absolutely put a system in place that does not require full-time dedicated internet access to make it run. For sure. There are plenty of options.
Excellent. So that's good to know for folks. So we have just a couple of minutes left. So looking back to some of these more at the start, someone wondered if the decision that I discussed was really a radical decision, given the case law that apartment owners can be liable for crimes committed in their buildings. And I do think it's being received that way, this newest decision, as being noteworthy and making a change, because up until now, notwithstanding what does go on relative to apartment buildings, up until now, with respect to condominium associations, there hasn't been a whole lot of feeling that the association would be responsible for, the criminal acts of third parties. There have been some cases here and there where, again, the circumstances sort of dictated the outcome. I can think of one where, the association had been aware of multiple break-ins to the building, before something happened in the building, or the association had decided to engage in a particular type of security measure, but did it on a singular basis. So, meaning that they provided some extra security for windows, but not for doors, or vice versa. And then when someone gained entry through whatever wasn't addressed, the court said, well, you made the decision to get into the security game. And once you do that, you need to do it right. And you're not doing it right if you're addressing, some things, but not all things. But this general concept that, an association, a property manager is going to face trial in a wrongful death suit with respect to a condominium is fairly new and is being viewed as a change an important one for most people. Now, I guess maybe depending on, and I don't do landlord tenant, so I'm not big on, you know, the law or the cases involving things like apartments and apartment rentals, but you know, maybe based on what's going there, folks in condominiums should have started worrying before now. But it might just be that because of the differences between the two, people haven't. But in any event, that has been the general reaction to the decision, is that it's a big deal because it's potentially going to be putting a new perspective on things.
Yeah.
There was also a question about the notion of the hybrid solution and a hybrid of what two things. So depending on the particular instance, and I know that's something that I mentioned, the idea was that you might have a hybrid product that involves, you know, some technology, but isn't necessarily a high-tech device. And so you're coupling a bit of technology with a bit of, you know, sort of manual involvement as well, as opposed to something that's totally high-tech. That's what I meant in terms of hybrid. I don't recall, Chris, if that was a term that you used as well.
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, but you're spot on. I mean, it's you know, the idea of controlling access again, which would be typically a manual kind of transaction with some degree of technology. And again, it can be very, very simple as a key fob, but very, very complicated to, you know, again, mobile credentials on your phone. So it's a combination of those two pieces together. That's all.
All right. So with that, it looks like we have worked our way through the comments and questions that we received today.
Yeah.
And so we're just about at the end of the time too for us on this platform today. So I'm going to again thank everybody who attended for your time. I'm going to remind everybody that if questions come up after today, please feel free to reach out to us. And I want to thank you, Chris, for doing the presentation with me today and for providing a whole lot of insight into what goes on in the security industry in terms of what you can provide for properties and all of the options, you know, with respect to the products that are out there.
Right. And my pleasure, Gary. Thank you for the opportunity. Great to be here with you, and I hope folks found that helpful.
Excellent. Have a great day, everybody.